Welcome to CivilNet. This is your host, Eric Hacopian, and today we're honored to have as our guest Professor Georgi Derluguian from NYU. He teaches sociology there, and we've had him many times as our guest, and he's one of our most delightful and most popular guests. Thank you for being here, Professor. Today's show is about giving a larger context to the war in Ukraine, where it comes from, where it's going to lead to, and its impact on Armenia. And where I'm going to start is with something that I noted reading in Putin's long monologue that he gave about 50 minutes. One of the things that he said, which was quite interesting, was that in the year 2000, he asked Bill Clinton if Russia can be part of NATO. And he said the answer wasn't so many words, silence. And if you go back and read the archives in 1990, there was apparently a similar conversation between James Baker and Gorbachev, where Gorbachev asked the same thing, and the answer was in so many ways silence. So my question is, post-war, and obviously this war, there was one person that made the decision to start this war, which was Vladimir Putin, but obviously wars do not happen in a vacuum. There's almost a 30-year road that probably brought us here. To what extent was the West ever interested in incorporating Russia into its political military systems? Or is Russia always viewed as the political, cultural, or military other that's always going to be the enemy and should always be confronted? And how much of that led to this moment?
Thank you. So first of all, to give a preview to our listeners, this is a catastrophe, but the kind of catastrophes that happen in geology, in ecology, in historical evolution that are producing new landscapes. We're trying to guess, so what would be the landscape, because new landscapes are built from pieces of old landscapes. So when dinosaurs die out, there were mammals around still, and not all dinosaurs die out, as we know. Those birds are still around. So here, we should look into the past, and you're absolutely right, and I think, we have to go into even longer past, because as Joseph Schumpeter, the great Austrian economist, said, in world economy, a century is like a day. These are glacially moving structural processes that produce earthquakes, but then they are moving very, very slowly. So to remind you, in the 1970s, early 1970s, America looked to many people, starting with Americans themselves, as a place in deep trouble, probably in decline. So this is when they started speaking about America's decline. It was the war in Vietnam, double-digit inflation, presidential candidates were killed all the time. American automobile industry was losing its competitive advantage, which was the most shocking thing anybody could have imagined. And to remind you also, remember that song, Domo arigato, Mr. Roboto. So Japan was this rising giant, very scary, just like China today. It's very useful sometimes to revisit expert opinions from the past, to see what goes wrong, what everyone was predicting, why. Back in those times, it was common wisdom. You said West. Which West? America and Europe, France, or Britain, which West? So there are many different Wests. It was a common opinion, however, especially in Western Europe, of course, that something called convergence was taking place between socialism and capitalism. We started from different premises, but we are moving somewhere to the meeting of the golden mean. And of course, the
Euro-communist.
That's Euro-communism on one side, which was becoming kind of an important elite, heterodox thinking in Moscow. Very much like, say, French aristocracy before the revolution in 1789. Were almost entirely libertarian or libertine and atheistic, but of course, they could not be too openly that, but in Eastern Europe it was, of course, they were all thinking about becoming part of Europe, but also in the West. People from Raimon Aron on the right, through Leo Tinbergen, I remind you, these great names, so at the time, all the way to Chancellor Willy Brandt, they all thought, that the West is meeting somewhere halfway. And Soyuz Apollo, remember there was the space flight, 1970s was the detente was the high point of that, Helsinki meeting in 1975. So what was the economic and geopolitical thinking behind that? That Europe recovered after the Second World War devastation, and another very big shock for many European countries, to remind you, decolonization. Today we kind of neglect, that even Belgium had colonies. Portugal, that European Union is a club of former imperial powers, even Denmark, even Sweden. Russia was another imperial power which kind of preserved itself thanks to the communist revolution in time, and huge role its armies played in defeating Hitler. And so on the other side there was this huge Russia, but it was mellowing. It was not Stalinist any longer. It was playing with market reforms. And the elites were distinctly interested in becoming more European, and actually they were closer to Europeans than to Americans, because European mentality, the business mentality, is more corporate, more statist, German companies, French companies, Italian, they were very much on the same wavelength as their Soviet partners, or Hungarian, for that matter. So if you remember goulash socialism of the times. Yeah. So this must have been deeply troubling to some thinkers in Washington. So where does this leave America and American leadership? One of them came up, it was Henry Kissinger, who came up with the brilliant idea of establishing relations with Maoist China. Because China in 1972, what did it look like? Much crazier than North Korea today. Right? It's just out of horrific cultural revolution. Mao Zedong was still alive. It was huge and starving. So the idea was that if we try to feed them, if we allow them a little modernization, the best weapon actually that the United States possesses is not nuclear weapons, it's access to the American domestic market. So if we bring them along like we did with Japan, with South Korea, we will tame them. Of course, it was a futile project, because China cannot be tamed. It's historically a dragon. So if you study history, long history of the last 1,000 years, you would realize that China had been the center of world economy, for centuries. And then there was the second invention, and that goes to another very famous American politician of European origin, Zbigniew Brzezinski. He invented the support for Islamists. So the Soviets walk into the trap in Afghanistan. It was a very nice story. So it used to be a common joke in my generation in Moscow that the man who invented the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was Brzezinski, telling
it is actually true. It's literally true.
Almost literally true, yeah. Because he was very widely read at that time. And Brzezinski had this brilliant idea that with all the problems after the Vietnam War, the United States could not and should not engage militarily, but there would be these wonderful proxies who are paying for themselves with Saudi money. Of course, that produced what American intelligence community calls a blowback as well. So there are two massive blowbacks. And then, there was, the European side of that. And let me answer your question, with a short story. That I used to teach at one very elite university in the United States for a long time, and one of our visitors was a European, pretty high official. Let's say that he was a former minister of finance of his country, and when these people reach that position, next step is somewhere in the EU apparatus in Brussels. We had a very cordial conversation in the evening with a few drinks, and I asked him, now that Ukraine is a democracy, it was just after the first 2004, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which, by the way, notice, it's an embarrassment even thinking about it. anybody remembers the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. But it was quite a glorious event. So I was kind of now, how long would it take to integrate Ukraine? I said never, because they have 1950s vintage obsolete industry, which is environmentally a nightmare. It's coal, steel, and so forth. We just finished off demolishing our own coal industry in Europe. They have over-educated population, over-aged, so they're massively nearing retirement. So they need retirement benefits and healthcare rather than there would be a workforce. And their aspirations are almost entirely European. So these people, poor whites, so they want to be European. So we need rather a country with younger, less skilled, disciplined population, preferably with a regime which is not very democratic, because we don't want to get into all the problems with environmental and labor legislation. Something like Turkey, something like China. So Turkey is kind of Europe's China, nearest thing. Where we could put out much of our industry, and they would be paying the retirement benefits of our retirees for the next 25 years. That after 25 years, I don't care. I won't be in my position. So, but European Union is a bunch of democracies. Once we put this on a referendum, every time we fail, because of our own internal regulations. So what remains are these endless negotiations about European accession, and we are very good at that. We will be endlessly creating new conditions, year after year. So I think this is more of a cynical bureaucratic answer, and it's not some kind of a civilizational distaste. So that is invented then by commentators, by pundits. So there was this bureaucratic inertia, and the lack how in all times bureaucratic inertia is overcome by political will. There was lack of political will at the time. So that's all.
If I was to summarize it, essentially what you're saying is that Russia was too large, problematic, too old,
yes,
to really incorporate into the Western system under any scenario, regardless of people's intentions.
Back in those times. Yeah. Now it might change.
Yeah. One thing is, as we know, one of the history is full of large countries and their leaders making terrible geostrategic decisions based on the fact that they're really looking at the wrong problem. And in the United States case, it was the invasion of Iraq, which was an absolute utter disaster in so many ways. When you look at the Russian or the Putin's obsession with Ukraine, which is on a good day a dysfunctional country, it's the poorest country in Europe. And as you said, because of the reasons you outlined, its prospects are not dramatically good under any scenario. Is it not true that the primary geopolitical threat to Russia actually does not come from the West? Because up until this war leading to the rearming of the West was in absolutely no position to militarily threaten Russia in any serious way. That the actual real threat to Russian long-term security is actually what is likely to come, which is the devolution or the collapse of the 7 Central Asian states between Armenia and China, who, because of the nature of their political system and with the backdrop of decarbonization, which is heading our way over the next 15, 20 years, they all have time clocks. They all have 0 hours that they're going to collapse. And frankly, Kazakhstan was the biggest warning, because in those 7 countries, Kazakhstan is actually the star economically and even on per capita income. So if Kazakhstan can be a hair's breadth away to going into absolute chaos with things like Salafist gangs and different things, is that not really the greatest threat to Russia's national security, much more so than Ukraine? And then as a closer, what impact does that have? What impact can that implosions between Azerbaijan and all of these countries have on Armenia?
You have 2 questions here. One is about the imagination of leader, and this is my it's not just mine, it's a strand in international relations theory, that strategy is very much informed by political imagination. That everybody in policy world wears special lenses. And sometimes, their lenses, are particularly cut and refractive. So with Vladimir Putin, well, you have to realize, two things, that he was not the first among the Russian leaders, to resort to rearmament and war to try to boost the prestige of his country. It was Yeltsin in Chechnya in 1995, which was a disaster, which was promised to be done in a day. Actually, the infamous phrase of the Russian defense minister Pavel Grachev at the time, one paratrooper regiment in 2 hours, would fix it. So on the other hand, you have to realize that, let's remember, that in 2000, Putin was hailed by many people in the West as a German in the Kremlin. He is fluent in German. He looks more European, than a traditional Russian leader. And he was, by the way, also the first foreign leader to call President George W. Bush after 9/11 and offer help in Afghanistan. Soon afterwards, in Moscow, there was an expression making rounds, that in Washington there is no notion of gratitude. They never thanked Russia for that. And the first 2 terms in office of Putin was spent trying to get himself into the West. About until the Munich speech in 2007, telling them that if you don't, then I turn my back on you. Of course. Remember, in 2008, he stepped down as president because he faced term limits. Of course, he would come back, and then today we look as an unbroken dictatorship, since 1999, a personalistic regime, which it became, but he cared for some reason, to follow the constitution, to look more European, not to look like a leader of Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan, at least in the eyes of the West. So he was still caring for this sort of decorum. Mm-hmm. The rest, it calls not for a sociologist. We need somebody, some great political biographer, some historical writer who would explain to us, this personalistic transformation. Because what we saw, we just saw how Putin totally isolated himself from his own elite. That televised meeting of the Security Council of Russia was a great piece for stage analysis, how it was just every detail there was so telling, and how he was dealing with his elite. So that's why, by the way, it's very unlikely that this regime could stay in power for very long, much longer, because it's really one-man show, and the debate whether it is Russia's war or Putin's war, I think it's quite conclusively showing it's Putin's war. These are the processes going on in his head. Now, Afghanistan was considered to be America's problem. This is, guys, you did it, you broke it, now you pay for it. And I suspect that it might have prompted the invasion of Ukraine, because just like the American puppet forces in Afghanistan were routed within days by the Taliban, they were probably expecting the same route for the American puppet forces in Ukraine, as they thought about the Ukrainian armed forces, that it would be very much, American empire crumbling down on all sides. So they miscalculated massively on Ukrainian nationalism or Ukrainian patriotism here, and that basically one thing is true, Ukrainians fight like Russians, very much, like Russians in great patriotic war, because what we haven't seen on massive scale yet is a guerrilla war, because the next stage would be partisan. So I think not enough people, both in the West or in Russia, considered Central Asia to be their problem. So for almost everyone, it was somewhere there. And that's why I also think, that we will see surprises. 2022 will be a year full of surprises. Just like Kazakhstan was a big surprise, we might yet see big surprise in Moscow, what many people hope for, but a still bigger surprise could be Western help in reviving the Russian armed forces. Because who else, yes, think about it, who else is going to do all those peacekeeping missions in Central Asia? So it will be collective forces, but I don't even exclude some joint operations, at this point, because Syria was essentially already de facto joint operation.
Yeah, it was.
Like at Hanoi.
It was also included the Iranians, actually. The Iranians, Russians, the West, all of the West, pretty much.
All of them.
Ah.
So as I remember, in 2013, somebody saying, I remember the threat of obliterating the regime in Damascus after the use of chemical weapons. When the Russians intervened, so there was very loud. There were very loud curses in Washington, and a still louder sigh of relief, especially in Europe, that somebody is doing this and it's not going to be the Islamists. So I think we are just in the beginning of reordering of the world. Germany is acquiring a geopolitical identity for the first time since time immemorial. This is going to turn the European Union into something else. They failed in the 1990s in Yugoslavia, to acquire this geopolitical identity. They dodged it again, during the crisis in Greece. So there were always, big worries about domestic constituencies. So you would know this better. You're expert on domestic processes. So why the European Union was always keeping such a low profile, to the extent, that we got into, once again, very misleading talk, pundit chat about the European malaise, that it's on its last legs. But now, by the way, with Brexit, it might be more steerable, because the Brits are not there any longer, it's wonderful. And France is not a great power, but France is a great catalyst. France is pushing into European Union as one. In a closed session, one European official once told me, this is when I appreciated the education. He said, look at the Italian Renaissance city-states. Florence, Venice, they're glorious in their prime 500-600 years ago. However, they ended up being a museum. We don't want to become a museum. Europe was becoming a museum and a dwarf in the new global world. So the only way out was uniting these former empires. And I wouldn't exclude, still now, these are typical paradoxes of big wars, that Russia might yet find, maybe even Turkey, a place in this constellation of former great powers. They are all former great powers. So once Russia is thoroughly humiliated, it should be, at least, this should be, if I were to say George Kennan, somebody, or Kissinger for that matter, that Russia should be revived, invited in, very much like Germany after 1945, because it's not only Central Asia. Remember about Syria, we named it, but the whole Middle East, which is, there are many signs, that Middle Eastern populations are fed up with their failed Islamism. By the way, the same with the Turks. And in this situation, we're going to see either bold decisions, or it will be really the decline of the West. So I hope, and let's hope, that there will be bold decisions, because it's kind of better to have functional capitalism at the moment than dysfunctional.
You said, I'm going to step back a bit in regards to Russian-Ukrainian idea. There's a bit of this, I call too much of a personalization of the Russian attitude towards Ukraine to Putin. However, if you go back and read many different people, people stretching that have nothing in common politically, from Gorbachev to Solzhenitsyn, there is a very unique backdrop in which, on some level, Ukrainian statehood is at best tolerated, not fully accepted, and some, depending on who the thinker is, they think this separation is almost unnatural. Mm-hmm. To what extent is that perception correct? To what extent are they wrong? What is the history of this? Is this attitude based on any fundamental facts, or is it just aspirations?
Russia, since the 17th century, again, empires take a long time, to build. So Russian Empire really comes together since the 1650s. It started in a century earlier, but it comes of age, in the 17th century, just before Peter the Great. And the way of integrating Russia was not forced Russification, but was finding a way to integrate local elites into the advantageous positions, so that basically Ukrainian Cossack elite would become Russian nobles and therefore be able to legitimately and very comfortably exploit Ukrainian peasants, rather than it would be Polish elite having Ukrainian serf peasants. So Ukraine was considered to be, of course, one of us, and there are many comparisons which were, for their time, in the late 20th century, probably correct, that Ukraine is at best like Scotland, and even lowland Scotland, to British Empire. That Ukraine supplied an uncanny amount, of Russian war heroes, Russian statesmen, and then just look at that. So there is very good, I think, the writer and critic, Dmitry Bykov, very nicely put it, that countries are invented by great writers. That Nikolai Gogol invented two nations, Ukrainian and Russian. Dead Souls is the invention of Russia. But Taras Bulba, by the same author, is the invention of Ukraine, or Ukrainian character. So they are kind of very inseparable twins. And of course, much of modern Ukrainian creativity was in the Russian language, which was more common, so intelligentsia used that language. This is going to stay in the past, most likely. It's very much like German language in Czech Republic. So what happened, to remind you, Kafka wrote in German.
German in Prague.
Yeah, and in Prague. So this is probably going to be left behind after this war. However, Ukrainian and Russian languages remain fairly close, almost mutually understandable with Belarus. So the problem was predominantly of the hierarchy, that Russia, or Moscow and Leningrad, were always higher in the hierarchy than, say, Kiev or Minsk. That people were moving, usually, from talented people, were moving, from Kiev and Kharkov, to Moscow. And of course, the real Academy of Sciences, the real, so there was, even in Soviet times, to remind you, there was Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kiev, but it was kind of a joke, Ministry of Foreign Affairs
they have a seat in the United Nations,
of Texas,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there was one of the units of two units, Belarus and Ukraine, had representation in the United Nations. That complex is overcome now. No, it's our Academy of Sciences, it's our art. However, there is a possibility within a different geopolitical configuration, very much like in the European Union, that such wounds heal in good economic conditions, remarkably quickly, just it will be resurfacing, like between France and Germany, or between Germany and Denmark, but it heals.
Well, I want to close with, it would be amiss not to talk about how Armenia fits into all this, and let's step back. We don't really know what the future brings, and even in the short term. We don't know how this war will end. The one thing that we do know for sure about the war ending is Russia's political defeat. How the war ends as practically into a quagmire, everyone's going to claim victory at the end. We know that. Everyone will claim victory no matter what the outcome. But most likely, in the short run, we're likely to have some new version of the Cold War for a short period of time, or maybe for a long period of time. We don't know. These are just X factors that are hard to determine. The new Cold War will be an emboldened Europe and a much poorer Russia playing the Soviet Union. How does this impact Armenia? And it's very easy to understand the negative impacts. We understand that. how does it impact? But every variable has two sides. There's a positive, what could happen that's correct and what could happen that's wrong. I want more focus on what the possibilities are than the negatives, because the negatives are quite self-evident because they're all related to national security. But I just wanted to see, in this configuration of this earthquakes, as you call it, where do we fit in?
Armenia could become quite important, including by implication, because Armenia is between these tectonic plates. So not to mention, of course, that Armenia, as Russians are now joking, is a new Harbin. Harbin is that city in northern China, where the emigres fled in the 1920s, massively. So the other Russia. So look in the streets. Actually, most of the time, I don't know how about you, I was addressed in Russian by waiters or by policemen in Yerevan. Now everybody speaks to me Armenian because there are still much more Russian faces around. This is a different Russia which is moving here, and that's probably serious. In the beginning, people were dazed, baffled by what happened, just escaping in any direction where they could. So we have all these funny stories about people having 10 minutes to catch a flight, whole companies relocating, and many of them thought that they could go for the West, because it's very interesting. In Russian language, also in Armenian, you don't say American repairs to your house, renovation. It's Euro renovation.
Euro.
Everything, Euro remont, everything is Euro standard. So this is a poor part of Europe, and this is a European mistake, that they did not find enough energy and finance in the 1990s, to integrate. Now, what is the role of Armenia? Negatively, as you said, so that nobody in the West would like to see another war in Karabakh. So it doesn't depend so much on Armenia, but let's very briefly, say that there is a temptation, of course. Standing between Armenians and Azeris in Artsakh are Russian peacekeepers. Russian peacekeepers could be dispirited, could be removed, something happens with them. That creates a temptation. Next, of course, you move into Artsakh, and probably it is surrounded, it is isolated, it would be overrun. But that's a recipe for guerrilla war. So two things will happen. First, Armenians will resist, and that resistance might last a week, 2 months, and that would be more than enough to create very negative appearance on TV screens. But even worse, there will be an exodus and probably massacre of civilian population. There will be ethnic cleansing, and that's very ugly, and it will be placing European and American politicians before a dilemma. They would have to do something. If they're doing something to protect the Ukrainians, they need to do something here. And what they're doing now, their standard new operation is sanctions, because they know where the money is. They know, they have been listening. Look at Ukraine. It was, it is a triumph of Western listening intelligence. So now we realize, just how much they have known, how deeply they have penetrated, and this must be a very disconcerting realization for all elites around the world. It's very transparent. However, Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan are very important to Europe, because every drop of extra oil, all natural gas, is very important. Turkey is another very big concern in Europe, because how to get Erdogan out and prevent hyperinflation and the place becoming another Venezuela, at the threshold of Europe. So Armenia here is both a positive, because of this small island of something. It could be ruined, easily. And Armenian Central Bank is doing, I think, a very wise job here. They open accounts very sparingly, because, enough of a single Russian oligarch pumping a couple $2 billion through Armenian banks, to be slammed with sanctions. So everybody, this is my calling for Armenians, for Azerbaijani leadership, for Georgians, who seem to be doing quite well here, for the Turks. be very, very careful about what you do, what you say right now. It's not actually necessary to say much at this point. Although of course, we hear many different cries from all sides, but be wise, this is a battle of giants. This is we're not exactly in the league, any of us, in the league here, and let's wait for the landscape after the battle. It's coming sooner. I don't think, this Cold War can last, precisely for going back to the beginning of our conversation. This is not Iran. Because Russia is much more developed, because there are very few Russian oligarchs or Armenian for that matter, who don't own property in London somewhere, their children are there.
Or presidents.
who are not foreign citizen. Yes. So this is not going to last. They are very exposed, and this is why, by the way, the West, or Americans and the British and Germans are so buoyant about it, because after the Taliban, they found finally, the kind of enemy which is exactly their size. It's a conventional war and hugely exposed to sanctions. So we need to wait. We need to use those opportunities. And I think Armenia is very good at using those opportunities, simply because Armenians don't even notice it. They are hospitable. They're smiling. It's great. There are many Ukrainians here,
and Belarusians actually,
and Belarusians.
Yeah.
So I have 11 refugees at my house. As fortunately, it's a big house. My wife right now is shopping for additional pillows because we don't have enough. So most of these people I've never met before, but they're friends of friends. Somebody calls me daily saying that, Georgi, I understand, but could you please? Yes, of course. So we are doing this, we are creating these obligations. And by the way, in the West, they should also appreciate that, that we are creating this new Harbin, which will be the way of reconstruction. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the United States government already had a secret group for the post-war peace planning. I hope that such groups already exist. So they should be planning, for what is going to happen in Russia, how they are going to stabilize Russia, how you're going to reform Ukraine, after everything. And frankly, you owe something to Ukraine and the Ukrainians, at this point. But as you mentioned, so Kazakhstan was just, let's recognize it was sheer luck. What happened in January, sheer luck in the sense, that Tokayev is pretty unique among Central Asian presidents in not only being Western educated, a diplomat and everything, but he has no family so far. There are no nephews, there are no children and wives. So Tokayev could be just great in his position. And of course, Kazakhstan has resources, and Kazakhstan has a very different elite. I have many Kazakh students, and they are very good. They're among the best of my students are Kazakhstanis. Actually, so there is hope there, and let's work on it.
Okay. Well, I wanted to. These are difficult times, but as always, it's quite insightful, both moving forward and moving towards history. So I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you. These are important times to speak.
No. Thank you for joining us at CivilNet this afternoon. Thank you.